Okay, let's look at how to set up logic first. Open up the program, start a new project, create 4 new software tracks. Let's make the first one any Ultra Beat drum kit, or any drum kit with any synth you may want. Let's make the second one an organ. Let's make the third one, very important, a bass. Let's do the Liverpool bass. Any instrument will do. I'm just using these as reference. Let's make this last one a synth lead. Okay. So you can see you have 4 different instruments, and if each of these tracks are selected, the entire keyboard is dedicated to playing this various instruments. So what we're trying to do is to split the keyboard so all these 4 instruments can be played at the same time. Okay, what we want to do now is tell each of these tracks to communicate on separate MIDI channels. On the Axiom 49, the drum pads are set to communicate on MIDI channel 10. So right over here, if you don't have this menu, you can just sort of bring it down like this. Select MIDI channel 10. The organ, let's do number 1, bass 2, and synth 3. Basically, we set up so all of these are now communicating on different MIDI channels. But as you can probably notice, if each track is selected, the keyboard is still just gonna play that selected track. Okay, and let's see, if all of these are selected, then the keyboard is gonna play everything at once. So the first thing to do is to eliminate that. Hold the record button until this menu pops up. Click on record settings and click on auto demix by channel if multi-track recording. Basically, now that everything is selected, we can play each instrument individually, so nothing is playing all at once, which is because they're communicating on separate MIDI channels. Now the second part of splitting the keyboard is done on the actual keyboard itself, but this is just the logic setup. Okay, in this part of the tutorial, we're going to set up the keyboard so each or some of the octaves will correspond to the instruments we set up earlier in Logic. We're going to do this by editing the zones. As you can see over here, it will say Zone 1, Group A. We're going to assign certain octaves to each of these zones, and these zones sort of communicate by some assigned MIDI channel that we will assign, and that way you will be able to control all the instruments that we set up in Logic at once. So let's start editing these zones. The first thing we want to do is select the zone range. So let's click on the zone group button and let's click on zone range. We're going to do C1 to B1. So you have to click on, sorry you can't see it here, but you have to click on the notes on the keyboard. So that's assigned. Now we're going to change the MIDI channel it communicates in. We want to click zone range and global channel at the same time. So we want this to communicate on channel 1. If it goes away, just press again. Channel 1. Okay. So now, that's pretty much it for zone 1. Now let's click zone groups. Click on zone number 2, which is over here. That's how you can change the zones. Now we're on zone 2. Let's edit that. Let's edit the zone range. And let's make it from C2 to B2. Okay. And we're gonna communicate on channel 2. Let's repeat this step for zone 3. Zone range. We're gonna make it from C3 all the way just to the end of the keyboard, C5. So we have 3 zones, and this is going to communicate on channel 3. The fourth zone, that for the fourth instrument, technically are the pads, but the pads are automatically set to communicate on channel 10, so we don't need to worry about those. Okay, now we have 3 different zones. In order for all these 3 zones to work, we need to activate them at once. So let's click on Zone Group, and then press all these 3 buttons at once. So all of them show up on the screen. Okay, so back here in Logic, we're going to see if everything works out. As you remember, we've assigned each of these tracks to communicate on different MIDI channels, which is the same thing that we did on the keyboard. We set up zones that communicate on specific MIDI channels. So we're going to do record enable all of these tracks. And it is important you do this, otherwise the keyboard will only play the instrument that is highlighted. By having all these, then the keyboard knows how to play everything and to separate them into different MIDI channels. So in zone 1, we set up communication on channel 1. So the first octave of the keyboard is playing just the organ, then the second octave is playing the bass, and then the synthesizer for the remainder of the keyboard, and the drum pads on the keyboard correspond to the drums over here. And of course you can play all of this simultaneously.